thank you for the lead up, because I'm going to be talking about a very interesting book. My section is on Afro-Puerto Rican consciousness. And the first book I'm going to talk to you about is El elemento afronegroide en el español en Puerto Rico. Slide, please. So he just gave me the entry. You didn't know that. You didn't know. Okay. Because I'm aware that we've run into the lunchtime on purpose, because we started late, but we'd like to stop at about 11:20, okay? I'm going to move fast in a series, 12:20, 12:25, so you have time. But we have a series of very interesting books, and I purposely started with this one, El elemento afronegroide en el español de Puerto Rico, that even though it came out, the first edition, in 1961, the edition that I read was a revised edition in 1974, which fell into the period of what we're calling the challenging period of new historiography in Puerto Rico. And why is this book is so important? This book is important for many reasons. Manuel Álvarez Nazario is really the first one that makes a very strong point that yes, the Afro-Negroid experience in the Puerto Rican language was real and important and valid. There were other linguists before him that say, no, we have some background in Taíno, we've had some background with, there are some words that come from the African, but it is his study, which was his dissertation, revised in 74, which really says it very, very strongly. He says, definir, I'll translate in English later, definir y analizar la huella que ha dejado el esclavo africano de antaño en el español puertorriqueño, mayormente en la expresión de nivel popular, with other linguists who really menospreciaron. They did not give the importance to the relationship of the relationship between the impact of the Afro-Boricua in the Spanish in Puerto Rico. And he does a couple of interesting things. One of the books that Arcadio mentioned, El País de Cuatro Pisos, also is translated in English. It's called The Four-Storied Nation. Yeah. And this one is called Country. The Four Country. I know, but we are a nation, but that's okay. That's another debate. That's for the afternoon. That's for the afternoon debate. They're right there waiting for us. Esclavos Rebelde is a really interesting reading, and it's more historical, and we have some interesting photos. This book also created quite a stir in Puerto Rico, because there was this thought that the esclavos didn't protest. They accepted being slaves, everybody thought, why do they think that? Because they weren't told the real history. Why do people, when you're not well informed, you will make wrong decisions or you'll have wrong information. It's not really your fault, but it's the way that the society is structured. So many people thought, no, los esclavos weren't,
It's interesting because in general, when you think of Puerto Rican history, what I've always learned was like, oh yeah, Puerto Ricans never fought.
Right.
They always existed.
Right. Yes. That's
like in general.
Okay. Well, you're gonna.
That's like the general profile.
Yes. Now but that has a purpose.
Excuse me?
It's a great way to keep it from actually acting up.
Right, actually.
Of course.
But if you look at, and that's why a lot of people never learn about the tax Congress and things like that.
That's the structure, but that's precisely, how we're structured, or we get structured to, be dumb.
But actually, in this context, what I'm bringing up is like within the historiography of
Yes.
Puerto Rico generally. You can look at the different.
Yes. No, for sure.
Racial groups, but even just as generally as a nation, it's seen as a nation that has really fought for its freedom.
All right. I'm going to correct some of that. We're going to correct some of that, okay? And this is why this book is so important and why it caused such a stir. Now this, the author, Guillermo Barral, what does he do? He gets into, to do this kind of research. He really did research. These 3 books that I'm presenting really have done, Isabello had to get into real primary sources. He did research. The first author had to get in. He got into, the town, papers and archives, and he was looking, so he really did serious research looking for this information. Now, I will summarize it with you because it's on tables, and again, if you write for the PowerPoint, you'll see it all. So I'm just going to summarize. But yes, there were slave revolts. Yes, we tried, and because I'm part of we're all part of our history. But it was convenient to say, no, they didn't rebel. They were treated well. They loved being slaves, that kind of thing. Okay, so it did create a stir, precisely because it was thought that the slaves in Puerto Rico were docile, that they did not rebel, that they were well treated by their masters. Yeah, sure. So this is invaluable research that he does. All right, let's move on to, there were more than, okay, before we get to the table of the revolts, this is I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No.
I just wanted to, just a comment here, because I think it's important with the last 2 books. I think that the fact that Barral, but also I think Narciso Espuelas Placero, Zenon, I think this is another example too, just to add to the complexity, the very important resonance of the civil rights movement and a new African-American history in Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean. Not only Fanon, but also Fanon was very important here too. There is a sort of, these books are part of a new response.
Yes.
And one can read them from that point of view as well.
Yeah.
Just like the Black is Beautiful and the Afro, saw also some of the books. And the idea of rebellion and to study rebellions, slave rebellions, was very important here as well. And I think that's interesting, because it brings our history to other histories.
And to the Caribbean.
But to connect to that as well, I think it's actually the anti-colonial, right? It's like, it is the separation of the African colonies from Europe that become that decolonization. Right? In Puerto Rico and in the civil rights movement in the United States, right? It's really this global phenomenon of overthrowing the European powers. And to overthrow that, then you have to have a new history, new story. And then who are we once we get rid of you and your stories about us? There's an absence, right? And what you see here is a filling of that gap.
And because in the Caribbean, there's movements, and had been movements over the 50s and 60s also. So we get impacted by them. And that also impacts the slave revolts, what's happening in the other islands, particularly in Haiti. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to comment that the influence of the Cuban Revolution,
Yes,
that did so much to bring the African consciousness in their film industry, in their theater, passed to Puerto Ricans very strongly in the work of Sylvia Del Villar.
Oh, Sylvia, of course. Yes,
and
yes.
Maria
That's,
who tried to
you're bringing the literary, the arts. We were saying that, this has another part. If we ever give this workshop again, we'd have to look at the part in the literature and the music, because the people you're talking about, at this very same time that these books were coming out, the writers, the artists, the musicians were creating equally, pieces of consciousness, yes, in different levels of the colony, of social class, of against racism. So there is that other piece. Thank you. So this map just shows, was it a revolt? Was it a conspiracy? Okay? You'll notice that there's a lot of conspiracies. And then after that it says, was it carried out, yes or no? Well, if it was carried out, they weren't betrayed. If it was not carried out, most often they were betrayed. Los chotas, as we call them. They were betrayed, okay? And then usually there was some sort of military intervention. So we have a history of Chota that went back when, okay? So you see here that I'll talk of the biggest of the revolts, which are 3 or 4. I will talk about them, but you'll see that the latest one is 1848 for a period of time, okay, of the uprisings. And it's a very interesting table, but you'll see how many times it says, yes, it was carried out, and then how many times they were betrayed, okay? Which ones were uprisings, which ones were conspiracies. So it was a mixture of conspiracies, actual revolts, small revolts, etc. So from this period of time, okay, 1795 to 1848, there's 22 total of conspiracies and different activities, right? Another form of protest, before I come back to this, was of course the running away, the flight of the slaves, of the cimarrones, of the bozales, who were the most rebellious of all, and especially the young ones, okay? And the time frame also of this, that between 1794 and 1804 was the period of the Haitian Revolution. Haiti becomes a free country in 1804. What happens? How that got to Puerto Rico. No cells, no internet, but the information gets around the Caribbean that Haiti is free. There's no slaves. They have a country. What does that do to Puerto Rican slaves? It gives them ánimo. It gives them, a sense of, we need to struggle, okay? So don't believe that Puerto Ricans didn't struggle. Yes, our African brothers and sisters did struggle against slavery. They weren't as successful, and they never got to the point that Haiti got to get an army that would fight. But there were 2 main attempts. One that had mercenarios, and the other one that was a Dominican that was armed, that came to the island, but he got stopped. So there were different attempts, and I'll just mention, because I want to talk about another book, the 2 or 3 of the most important of the rebellion. One of the most important was the one in 1812. Where's 1812? It's on this side, okay? It did not get carried out, but it had a lot of people in Bayamón. The area of the north that you saw in the map, from Bayamón, the north, was and Ponce, were the 2 areas that were very militant. There was much activity going on. The 1826 Ponce conspiracy, and then the ones in 1846, which were the final of this period that were studied, and they found where there was more activity, was more uprising, more people, but they were all repressed. They were all found out. Even those that were uprising, the military moved in, okay? And what was the reprisal, okay? They were killed. They were lynched. They were, it's heavy, okay? And that's death, jail, lashes. Some were expelled from Puerto Rico. And, but it's even those that conspired to bring in an army to found La República Boricua, as they called it, and did not succeed. After this period, I'm moving a little fast and I'm leaving out a couple of things, but after this period, the next time that slaves are involved in an action is, of course, 1868, the Revolución de Lares, okay? Which is a total, according to the numbers, but probably there were more, of 46 slaves that were, as the revolt did not proceed, that were castigated legally for a short period. So there has been an issue of some of the revolts, conspiracies were well planned, okay? some were not. Let's move on to the bomba. Okay, the importance of the bomba. The importance of the bomba, do we know what the importance of the bomba is? It's not just for dancing. The bomba was, as many of you might know, we thought we had some music. Oh, okay. All right, yeah. The importance of the bomba is because the bomba was a means of various things. Hiding what they were conspiring, communicating with others with the tambor and the songs that the Spanish did not know, the words of different African tongues, and sending out messages to nearby conspirators of what they were planning. So the bomba was a very important system of, I don't want to call it internet, but social media. It was a way, and of course it's become an important expression, but it had a very important aspect. And the other place where they conspired was in church, because they were forced to go to church, right? And they would go to church, and during church, talk and conspire. So, just to end this part, let me see if there's anything else I want to say on this. This little book, and it's a little book, but the English one is larger, but the Spanish one is small. It's very, very rich information. And though he recognizes that there's a lot to be studied, and this was 74, since 74, there was one other book, but there hasn't really been, I have not seen anything on slave rebellion that has updated this. Have you seen anything?
Not slave rebellions, but urban slave revolts.
Oh yeah, urban,
which was translated.
Raúl Mayo. Raúl Mayo is another psychologist like me that likes history. Yeah, so there was a major revolt in Toa Baja that I should mention of the Lagoba Nation. And the Lagoba Nation apparently were very strong warriors, and they managed to set fire to the cane fields. They had, tremendous planning. They captured weapons at the depot. They got into the town, and they had a lot of people with them, but the military did stop them. And this was in Toa Baja in 1843. So, yes, we have struggled. Yes, we have had, attempts to free ourselves and free. Okay, so let's move on. We're getting now to Machete Ogun, which is going to be the last one that I'll have time to review that I want to talk about, because this is a very endearing book and it's quite different from the other studies. Okay, can we pass on? Okay, this book is dedicated to some of the Afro-Puerto Ricans that fought and died in the struggle against slavery. Marcos Cioro is one of the most known, Jaime Bangua, Bembe, Enrique Lagoba, which is the name of Lagoba, of one of the tribes, Margarita, Maria del Carmen, Ramona. And this is a different take. This is not a study, okay? I remember when they were working on this, this is a narrative piece, very interesting narrative piece. What the equipo who works on this, which were four, Guillermo Baral, Carlos, Lidia Milagros, and Ana Lidia Vega, is that basing on the facts of Baral's historical research, Ana Lidia, Carlos is the one that does the photos, Ana Lidia and Lidia Milagros write a narrative text. I love that. I just want to read one thing real quick to you. Maybe because I like narratives very much myself. But just to put it in their words, you can get a feel for how they say something like, how are people going to know what happened to you? What happened to you? Slaves, if we don't speak for you. Nobody has spoken for you. So we will speak for you. We will write and speak for you. So that's what they do, And I'm not going to find it because I thought it was in one of these yellows, but so it's a very interesting technique. And this book, the style of this book, we must say something else, because this was a period, talking about Freire, you're looking at a Freirean, okay, who did popular education.
My professor.
And you know, popular education in Puerto Rico, the late 60s, Freire and Fanon made it very big. We were all there, we read. And the thing is that this is a popular education. This was so that our people could read about what happened during the period of slavery. And it's very amenable, and it's a big book, you know. It was used more recently, from what I understand, but in my period, maybe in the more recent decades has been used in schools. Before it was used more with adults, okay? And it was part of conscious racingness groups that we had. So it's a different methodology, and it's a very creative methodology.
A lot has been done in the Caribbean, in other places, on other forms of resistance. And I remember that being discussed when Baral was presenting his book. Rebellion is not the only
Right,
one.
right.
Because abortion was very important, but not for all ethnicities. That's interesting, because there are documents that the Spaniards complain, and the French too, that the women were aborted.
Yes, yes,
That's
yes.
interesting. And suicide.
Yes,
But not
yes.
all ethnicities allow, let's say, authorize suicide in other religion, and that's
And the home, our
that's
famous, Yeah.
interesting, no? And also that in the case of the conspiracy of La Escalera in Cuba, which is similar, bigger, English becomes, you were suspicious. Slaves who knew English
from the islands.
from the islands were suspicious because they could understand the Bible in English, which was a sign of abolitionism. Because Spanish was not associated with abolition, but the British and the Bible in English was a symbol of abolitionism. And then you become suspicious if you know English and you read the Bible in English, or you listen to the Bible. That's interesting. And also that I remember discussing with Baralta and others, because in the reglamentos de esclavos, in all the reglamentos, one of the very clear dispositions there is that if you know about the slave rebellion, one of the few ways in which you can accomplish or achieve your freedom is precisely by telling on them. That's one. So the culture becomes very perverse in the sense.
Yes. But it
know,
relates to the first, people were so suppressed, so were so repressed, and punished and killed and executed and hanged, hung.
horribly
It's amazing that there still were rebellions.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Exactly.
so the spirit of cimarronaje has been and was live. So a tribute to our ancestors. So have a nice lunch. Come back before 1. We want to start at 1. Gracias. There's 2 big groupings. Those related to the Yoruba, the Sudan, and then those related to the Congo. That will be important later for those of you, I just want to tell you this, in terms of religious practices for you to know, which we won't get into today, but in terms of espiritualidad, the religious practices, there's some that are very much related to the Yoruba and some that are very much related to the Congo. But amongst the groups that came to Puerto Rico, the tribes that were brought, that were enslaved, were los Mandingas, which were in the first map, los Fulas. Where did the word Fulano come from? From a tribe called los Fulas, okay? But you didn't know that. Los Biafras were another one. Los Ganga, they come from Sierra Leone. Los Mendes. Well, do you know, if any of you go this afternoon, tonight, to the celebration of Fiesta de la Cruz, it's today, this afternoon, there are cantos, you wouldn't call them songs, but cantos that are in that experience that are called El Canto Mendes. Where does that name come from? It comes down from an African, right? And then you have the Minas, los Yorubas, los Bantu, los Congo. So there was definitely a relation of these tribes to our language, to our customs, to our religion, and then to the way that our ancestors learned Spanish and passed Spanish on. I want to share with you some of the words that come from, and these are just a few, because the book is, I wrote the pages down here, 481 pages, así, okay? A chunk is related to linguistics, but there's such a rich part related to the history of those that came, the words that they gave us, okay? And how that has been integrated. And just to step back a minute, I was interested in this book not because I was interested in linguistics. I happened to have found the book in 1974 because I was working with a community group in Puerto Rico, and I was, as I said, I was learning everything I could about language, and I would read everything. But I was with a group in 1968-69 that we were working in the communities. We were working in poor communities in La Perla, in Martín Peña, and in Villa Palmera. And I was in the area of Villa Palmera, which is in Santurce, and we wanted to give our group an interesting name. You know, we wanted to give, and half of our group was Afro-Boricuas, you know. Amongst our group was amongst the first Puerto Ricans that used Afro, you know. Aside from Lucecita Benitez, there were a couple other people not as well known that at the university that had Afros. And so I said, you know, we should give it a name that is historically positioned, that relates to our history, that it relates to recovery. And so I said, and then I went into a bookstore one day and I found this book. And I said, oh, let me see. And I start looking, and I said, oh my gosh, Los Helofe. That's the first group of African tribes that came to Puerto Rico early on, intermarried con los Taínos. And who were the Helofes? The Helofes were the ones that created the first rebellion against the Spaniards. And why didn't the Spaniards like them? Because, quotes, they were soberbios, inobedientes, revolvedores, incorregibles. So the Spanish did not want Africans from that tribe. And what did we give our name? We gave our workshop name Taller Helofe. Well, it's spelled two different ways. It's spelled with a J, excuse me, Jelofes. It's spelled with a G also, and it's spelled also Jolofes. If you ask for the PowerPoint, you'll see it. So I thought that was historically, since we were trying to look back in our history and bring it forth, when I went back to the group at a meeting, I said, look, this is the name we should, so that's the name we gave, Helofes. But it is true that they were no longer brought to the island because they were incorregibles, they were incorrigible. The interesting thing is that there are other tribes that were very revolutionarios against slavery. Of course, who wants to be a slave? And they were mostly the young, los bozales, which were the young Africans that came particularly after in the 16 and 1700s. So this was a fascinating thing. And to finish this review on this book, because we have 4 or 5 books I'd like to review, just a few words that come from our African ancestor, just for you to know. Titingo. Does everybody know what titingo means? Esto es un titingo. In English, how can you translate titingo? It's okay? Un revolú. It's no, but in English, a mess. A mess. Un titingo, it's a mess. Juba. We know that the baile juba of Bomba comes from also Africa. Burundanga. Burundanga is an African word. Did you think that merengue was? Merengue comes from via Haiti, from the Bantu, maringa. Okay, isn't it just from the Bantu, merengue. Bembe, motete. Motete is, pick up all your motetes, your stuff, your belongings. It's kind of like, has a connotation of stuff, because it's motete. And that comes from Angola, okay? You'll be surprised. Candungo, you know, a candungo is like a jar or something to carry stuff. That's also Angolan related. Guarapo, which is the thing of the caña, the juice of the caña. That's from Congo and Angola, okay? Tostón, where do you think that comes from? Tostón, you know that we all have tostones, tostón. It comes via Haiti. It comes via Haiti. Fufu. Fufu was a food. We don't, you know, it's not funche, which also is African, but fufu is, you know, te van a hacer un fufu. But it was a food. It was a food of yame and vegetables, almost like sancocho. It was, and it's Senegal or Congolese. Caravali, the famous legend of the African who hides in the mountains, of the legends of the famous, the legends that we read when we were kids, La Leyendas de, I forgot who the author is, the story of Caravali. How many of you read? Anyway, that's from Guinea. And cocolia. Cocolia is that little crab in the sweet waters. That's also African. So, you know, it's, and the word cimarron, obviously. But cimarron, it was stated originally was not African, was indigenous. It was from our indigenous. That was very interesting to find that out, okay? And it was appropriated by the slaves. Now, this is I think, a tribute to the background of our language and the richness of our language. And I know that most of us who went to school in Puerto Rico, if we went to school in Puerto Rico, throughout, like Arcadio said, we don't learn about this. We learned it when we get to college, y cuidado. But now more, I think now more. But you don't get this information, which is so rich, you know. So let's move to the next one, all right? Our next book also is an interesting, these 4 or 5 books that I'm gonna, you know, kind of go through quite, really all made like hits, you know, probably, or scandals, or were controversial, all of them. This was one of really, actually there's another one that's very controversial, but this was really one of the most controversial. Incredible, Narciso descubre su trascendencia. Isabel Zenon Cruz unfortunately died in 2002, young, at 63 years old. Isabel Zenon has really done an incredible, and it's 2 tomes. I always only had 1. When I tried to get number 2, the second, it just was out of print, or now it costs a lot to try to get it. But groundbreaking, what did I write here? Groundbreaking indictment of the racist, discursive practices by the island intelligentsia in Puerto Rico. Okay? It's a study of racialization and racism in Puerto Rican literature, Puerto Rican culture, refranes, sayings, music, all kinds of ways. He hits hard and right on how Afro-Boricuas have been marginalized, have been excluded from being Puerto Ricanos, from being considered in su Puerto Ricanidad, in their Puerto Ricanness, and have they been invisibilized on a level and vilified. So he hits very strong. I'm surprised this has not been translated into English.
It's very hard.
It's very hard, but it's very rich. Sometimes a little repetitive, but definitely it's a very rich book of the injustices that our African Puerto Ricans, Afro-Boricua Puerto Ricans have experienced. Now he does a couple of things I want to point out that are quite interesting, but consonant to that period of time of the 70s, okay? He examines the language, the marginalization, and he applies, and this is where I was more interested in him because I'm Fanoniana, he applies the theories of Fanon and Albert Memmi. During the early 70s, late 60s, those of us who were in the university, who were related to social movements, most of us read Fanon, studied Fanon, became, in my case, as my son well knows, very much strongly Fanonian. For those of you who may not know, that's no problem. Fanon was a Martinican anti-colonial psychiatrist who wrote tremendous books on the toxic, nauseous effects of colonialism on the psyche. And what Isabel Zenon does, whose a doctorate is in literature, he's a literature professor, okay? And by the way, he was the first one that started in 1969, corrígeme, the first class on literature on the Puerto Rican Negro, 1969?
Most probably, I'm not so
Okay.
sure, but most probably.
He gave a course that I think it was 1969, and it was fun. It was Zenon, and he applied some very important notions from Fanon and from Albert Memmi, precisely trying to understand the degree to which the way that the Puerto Rican black person had been treated had invaded their psychic. Of course it will. How it perpetuates certain kind of situations of racism, and how in the long run, let me quote from his on another page, el suicidio de su personalidad, negador de su negritud, to the degree to which you negate your blackness, your negritud, because of being constantly discriminated and constantly made invisible, how that in a way is a suicide of your personality, because you become another, which is not the person that you know. And he's very interesting in how, because at that time Fanon was being used more politically than for critical psychological psychoanalytic analysis, even though Fanon was psychoanalytically trained, social psychoanalytically trained. And I think that El Aporte, his work is seminal in how he used these background theories, how he criticized racism, and he was scandalous. When people read it, some people stood back because they realized, some who, well-meaning, realized, oh my God, I've internalized, that's what happened. Intellectuals and everybody, in the book at the back, you get a lot of letters from people writing honestly and says, oh my, I didn't realize that I had internalized this or this aspect that is really racist in the use of words, So some people began to really reflect how this society has done this to us, intellectuals. And they write, and he includes, letters at the back from Claridad, from poets, from Antonio Correter, from different people of examining their use of words, their use of phrases. So, he achieved, given the fact that he was relatively young, really a very important task. He achieved the task of helping us become more critically conscious of how we had internalized racism. I would hope, but I'm not sure, that he is still read at the university. We were all deslumbrado when the book came out and when everybody read it, and it said, oh my God. And it provided us the opportunity for self-reflection, self-criticism, okay? And to see how our culture, how we had to, change our culture. The culture had been passed on. Just because it's culture doesn't mean it's the best culture. And this was also said by Rafi Ramirez. We need to have a culture of liberation, not a culture of oppression.